February 12th, 1985. I'm Joe Todd. This is an interview with Mr. George Nelson in Woodward, Oklahoma. Sir, where were you born?
I was born in Woodward, Oklahoma on May the 27th, 1922.
Who was your father?
My father was George S. Nelson. Did you want the birthdates or anything on those?
Yeah.
He was born on August the 6th, 1878.
And your mother?
My mother was Myrtle L. Nelson.
What was her maiden name?
Sage.
Sage. And when's her birthday?
She was born September the 16th, 1880.
18. Where were your parents from?
My father was originally from Iowa. My mother was originally from Canada.
What kind of work did your father do?
My father here in Woodward, Oklahoma, lived here all his life. He worked for the city of Woodward.
And what did he do for the city?
He had a street repair and clean up around the city of Woodward. Worked for the city as general maintenance.
When did your parents come to Oklahoma?
My parents come to Oklahoma in 1889.
They come down for the run?
No, his dad came. My grandparents come down for the run, but my dad and mother come in 1889.
Okay. They come for the run of 89 or 93, which?
Well, they come down before the run.
Okay.
They were here before the run, and then let's see. I was trying to get what the date was on it. Fall of 1890. Well, they went back to Kansas, then they came back to Oklahoma in 1898.
Okay.
My father come down here before they were married.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went back to Kansas, and then they were married, and they come back to Oklahoma in 1889. Now, my grandparents, David E. Nelson, they homesteaded in Moscow Flats area,
Okay.
just east of Woodward.
Did you know your grandparents?
No, I wasn't quite old enough to remember.
Mm-hmm.
In my folks' family, there were 14 children,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm the youngest one of the children, and my older sister still lived. She was born in 1900, and I was born in 1922. So it was quite a family.
Yeah.
And
How come your parents came to Woodward?
well, the reason they came to Oklahoma, of course, from Kansas, is because my grandparents came down and homesteaded in the Moscow Flats area.
Mm-hmm.
Then they came into Woodward, and this is where they made their home.
Why is it called Moscow Flats?
Well, it's the area is Moscow, and it's down in the Mutual area, but it's strictly flatland.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason where it got its name was the Moscow Flats.
Okay. Is there a Russian community out there? Is that?
No, more or less it was more or less German community. Most of the people that were out in there, of course, my parents weren't German.
Mm-hmm.
They were Canadian Swedes. That's because my mother come from Canada and my dad was a Swede.
Mm-hmm. When did your dad's family come from Sweden? Any idea?
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Okay.
I sure couldn't tell you this. I don't know.
What kind of house did you live in as a child here in Woodward?
Well, when the ones that I can remember now, when I lived here, most of when I was younger, was houses that weren't modern. Of course, they had the outhouses, didn't have modern, didn't have water in the house,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't have gas, we didn't have lights.
What was the water supply?
Water supply, well, of course, in my time of days, the water supply, of course, Woodward had water supply, but were where we lived, most houses didn't have water.
Yeah.
Didn't have city water at that time.
You had a well out back then?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Tell me some of the chores you did around the house.
Well, when I was a small boy, of course, being from a family of 14, I was the youngest. Of course, we took turns around the house. We had to cut wood. We didn't have gas. We had the wood stoves. And our chores when we were kids going to school, we'd have to take turns getting up in the morning and building the fire, keeping the fire and warming things up. And of course, my dad always kept livestock. We had a cow, we had a goat. My brother and I, the one next to him, it was our duty to take care of those chores. We had chickens. And, we didn't live on the farm, but we more or less lived as a farm community here in Woodward.
Can you describe the main street of Woodward when you were a boy? What did the town look like?
Well, now the main street of Woodward, when I was a young, very young, my dad would take me down. The main street of Woodward wasn't paved at this time. I do remember paving the main street of Woodward. I remember Oklahoma Avenue, which now is one of the main highways in Woodward. It wasn't paved at this time. I do remember paving this, and they used mule teams to do all the work with it.
Now, do they pave it with bricks or what?
No, at that time it was paved. It was concrete.
Yeah, okay.
At this time, my age, it was concrete.
What year was that? When did they pave the streets here?
Oh, goodness, you're asking me a question I don't know whether I can answer or not. 22. I'd say in the 30s. It would be in the 30 area there.
What was the major
during
business?
during the Depression?
Yeah. What were the major businesses here?
Well, your major business was just like your Mortison had a dry goods store. Of course, they had their variety stores. But the main business in Woodward, I think, was farming, farming community. You know, livestock.
Okay. Tell me about the Depression, the dust storms. How did the Depression affect you and your family?
Well, at the time of the Depression, what affected my family, of course, being from a family of 14, and I can remember very vividly, I wasn't too old, but it seemed as though all my brothers and sisters moved back home. And the Depression, I think, was very hard on my parents. Because I was young enough that it didn't affect me as far as worrying about making a living, but I can look back now and imagine the things that my folks had to go through on the Depression end of it. Of course, when my dad was working for the city of Woodward, he had a fair job at this time, and he made a good living for his family. Of course, I can remember times when there's a lot of things we desired that we didn't have. And these are things that you think back, and now is time you think about the good times that you're going through now, but you look back then and you can see that the times were pretty drastic. I've seen lots of times that you couldn't afford to buy a pair of shoes, and I know my folks would have liked to, but they couldn't afford it. And I knew this.
What about the meals? What did your mother fix in the Depression?
My mother, mostly on the Depression days, of course, we all look back and we can, potatoes and gravy was a very outstanding item as far as I'm concerned that I can remember. Whenever you get to, say, the meat dish or something like this, it would be the time when they butchered or something like this, but other times meat was one of the things you didn't have.
Did that Depression bring neighbors closer together?
I think so. I think back in the Depression time, I can remember my folks used to take us and we'd go visit with people, but now we don't visit with people like we should. And it's a shame that we don't, but it's one of those things, you get further apart. I think you get involved more or less in your own family more than you do in neighbors.
And I guess neighbors helped each other too.
Yes, they sure did. I know there was times when neighbors helped out neighbors as far as making a go of it, you know.
Tell me about the dust storms and Black Sunday.
On the dust storm Black Sunday, the one thing I can remember, I was down at my sister's house, my oldest sister's house. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and you looked over and it just looked like the sun was shining at the time, but this dust rolling in was so black that when it did come in, that you could hardly even see your hand in front of it. And it was dark. It was pretty near like it's turning the lights out. And as far as I remember, the breathing was terrible. It was so close and so tight with dirt and dust that you wouldn't have to put something over your nose and mouth to be able to breathe it.
Could you keep the dust out of the house?
No, there was no way. At that time, houses at that time was beyond the point of being secure, you know. We didn't have insulation, and the windows were. During the Depression, you didn't live in homes like you do now.
How long did that dust storm last, Black Sunday?
Black Sunday, it seemed to me like it rolled in there on Sunday, and the next morning wasn't as black. There was still lots of dirt in the air, but this dirt accumulated, even on the tables, it would accumulate to where it would cover up, say, a piece of paper, that the dirt would just settle in the house.
What caused those dust storms?
It seemed, near as I can remember, they seemed to think that it was caused from the way the erosion of the land and the way they was plowing the land. And at that time, we didn't have, like our Fort Supply Dam and our Canton Dam and things like this too. And it was just more or less a drought. And when it dried up and the winds in Oklahoma, and all they could do was blow this dust into the air.
When did you start school?
When did I start the school? Where did I start school?
Yes.
I started school in Woodward.
What?
1928.
They just the
6
Woodward
years.
Public School?
Yes,
And you go through high school?
Yes, I graduated from Woodward High School
What year?
in 1941.
1941.
This year will be 45th anniversary.
Yeah. Did you do any work for the WPA or CCC?
No, sir, I did not.
Yeah.
I wasn't quite old enough for it.
Did you have any? Do you think you were going to get involved in the war in Europe?
Well, being involved in VFW, like I am for the last 5 years, I've been in real active and went through the state chairs. I was state commander last year, state of Oklahoma. I don't know whether we'll get involved in.
No, this is in high school.
Oh, when I was in high
Yeah,
school.
40 and 41.
Yes, I felt like that there was something coming. Of course, when you're in high school age, you don't visualize of ever being in the service. But it did happen, and I graduated in 41 and went into service in 42.
What did you do on Pearl Harbor Day?
Pearl Harbor Day? Well, I can remember Pearl Harbor Day pretty vividly. It was me and a friend of mine was down on the North Canadian River, and we come back to his home, which is just right on the river, Bill Hopper and I. And when we were there, they announced the Pearl Harbor attack on Sunday morning when we come back up to the house. And it was a very depressing feeling. Of course, at that time, I suppose, we didn't realize what war was. I was young enough that I didn't realize. But then the following year, I was drafted into the service.
And
I was in a 20-year-old draft. First
Yeah.
20-year-old draft. That's what I was on.
back in the Army?
Yes.
Where'd you go to basic?
I went to basic training in Jefferson Barracks, Missouri was the first place that I went. From Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, I went to Bradley Field, Connecticut.
How long was basic?
6 weeks. 6 weeks basic in Missouri.
And you trained with the Springfield all through?
Yes. Well, when we first went in, they didn't even have enough rifles. We trained with wooden rifles in Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. Even guard duty had wooden rifles that either wooden rifles or ball bat.
And then you were.
They weren't supplied enough at that time. See.
And then you went to Connecticut?
Yes, I went to Bradley Field, Connecticut.
What was it there?
It was out of Hartford. It was an Air Force base.
And what kind of school was that there?
All right, and I went to MOC school, or a non-commissioned officer school. I went to, I believe, 4 different schools while I was up in Connecticut. And then from Connecticut, we went from Connecticut, they sent us to Richmond, Virginia. And from Richmond, Virginia, we left Richmond, Virginia, we was sent to San Francisco, and that's where I went overseas from.
And where'd you go overseas?
I went overseas to the islands. I went over to the islands the first place we left.
Hawaii?
No, we left San Francisco. We went to New Guinea. And when we left San Francisco, it was exactly 30 days from the time we left till the time we landed in New Guinea, and we never seen land of that 30 days.
Anything
Zigzag.
happen on that trip?
About the only thing that happened, most of them got sick.
Ever see any Japanese or-
Nothing outstanding, going over, no sir. But that was the idea of taking so long, they had to zigzag in the convoy going across.
Hit any storms or typhoons?
We hit one bad storm.
Tell me about that on the ship.
Well, of course, being from Oklahoma, that was news to me. That's the first time I'd ever seen the ocean, really. Or you might say seeing a ship. When everybody got sick. And it was one of those things that you wished you'd have been back home, you know. Of course, you both went through it. But it was quite an experience. Of course, when we was going over, we went across the international date line, in which was quite an experience of going from gaining a full day's time one way or the other, you know. But other than that, the trip wasn't too bad. It was crowded. We went over on a Liberty ship, which was they called a converted banana boat. And they had bunks in the holes where they stored banana, and what it was just canvas bunks, and they were 6 high. And you can imagine people getting sick down in there, you know. It was quite a little experience on that.
And when did you land in New Guinea?
We landed in New Guinea. Let's see, I spent 18 months overseas, and I spent 18 months in the States. So I was in the service 3 years. Well, about half of that time, 42, 43, had been about late 43 that I went over.
And what were your duties when you got to Indonesia? Or, I'm sorry, New
when
Guinea.
we got into New Guinea, we landed in New Guinea. We landed at Finchhaven. New
Now,
Guinea.
had we already invaded
Yes.
from Australia?
Yes, we went into New Guinea 2 days after D-Day into New Guinea, and we landed at Tacloban. But we landed up away from the city of Tacloban about 3 miles. It was up the bay, and they unloaded us out of LSDs. And the main object there was we took a load of fuel with us, and it was in 30 to 60 gallon containers, you know. But when they unloaded us, they couldn't get it clear in, and so we had to roll all this through the mud and muck up to your knees and your hips, and we had to get all this up out of the bay there, where when the tide went out, we wouldn't lose all this fuel. But when we were on New Guinea, we were there 3 weeks, and the only time our feet would dry is if we happened to get on our cot and dry them off and go to bed. Other than that was the full time. And when we were on the New Guinea we had hammocks, and we'd swing them in between the palm trees, you know, coconut trees. But it got to the point every night the Japanese would come and infiltrate in, and they was cutting the American throats right in the hammocks. So we all got to where we just slept in the mud. We wouldn't sleep because you could see the hammock, the silhouette of a hammock, you know. And I would sleep in mine. I just slept on the ground to keep them from, you know, coming up on you after dark.
And what was your job in the Army at that time?
I was a squad sergeant. This time, when I got overseas, I was a staff sergeant, 4 stripes. I was in charge of a full squad of 55 men in this airborne division I was in. And our duty there when we got into New Guinea, the main thing that we done was a 115 field hospital. When we got into Tacloban, we built the 115th field hospital. And then another duty on New Guinea was we had to keep up the airfield where the planes would come in.
And now, were you an airborne unit?
Airborne unit, but they were airborne engineers, is what it was, glider troops.
Okay. Tell me what an airborne engineer does.
Well, airborne engineers, as far as when I was in our main object is when we went into like New Guinea and then the Philippines was to keep up the airstrip. The Japanese would bomb and tear up the airstrip. It was our duty to go in there, patch this up, keep everything going. And on New Guinea, we built a complete new airstrip on the Coral Rock.
Did you have any ground attacks of the Japanese?
We only had one, and it was in New Guinea. One night they tried to infiltrate and take over our where we was working on this airstrip, and this was the only contact on New Guinea that we had.
Okay. And how long were you there in New Guinea?
I think we was there probably about 3 months. I'm just, referring back to it. Then from New Guinea we went into the Philippine Islands, and we stayed in the Philippines up until we stayed in the Philippines and worked on the airstrips there and kept them going until we then we went into Okinawa.
How long were you there? What part of the Philippines were you in?
I was at Philippines was Tacloban was in the Philippines and that was in it was on I believe it was I can't recall, but I think it was Honshu, the Honshu Island, but it was Tacloban was the capital where we was at.
Did you help in the liberation of any of the prison camps?
No, sir, but I did have the experience of when we were on Okinawa. Then, when the peace was signed, of course, when the war was over, they flew us into Japan, and we flew in. They brought in commercial airlines, which was very unusual. But they did fly us, and our outfit was one of the first ones off of Okinawa to fly into Japan. We flew over to Battleship Missouri the day they signed peace and landed at the airstrip out there. And to me, there was more Russians there than there was Americans. And this was very unusual.
Yeah.
And you can tell the Russian anytime you see them was on account of their red uniforms.
Right.
And
what did you feel that day, the VJ Day?
VJ Day, well, my feeling on VJ Day when the Japanese gave up, it was a very much of a relief because they had us training on Okinawa, and the deal was when there was planned the invasion of Japan, and being in the glider troops, they was going to fly us with gliders. The outfit I was in was going to fly us in over the lines, drop us inside of Japan, and on D-Day we were to fight our way back out to the coastline. So to me, I felt real relieved. I knew that this would have been a suicide mission. It would have been a suicide mission. It would have been very fortunate probably would have come out of it alive. So I felt that I was very fortunate the war was over.
What did you feel or think when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima?
Did they decide they were going to be here 3 days or something, or what?
No, they're just going to be here today.
When
Was
they-
you going to be here tomorrow? What was you?
No.
I don't think so.
We'll be in, I'd like to, we already have plans for
Well,
Shattuck and Laverne.
I can work on another day with you
Yeah.
if you like for us.
Okay. When they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima.
When they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, well, you hated to hear it, but yet you was glad to see that it was over. We knew that when they dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that it was going to be the end of the war.
Yeah.
And the night that it ended, I just happened to be that we were at they had the outdoor movies for us, of course, for entertainment. I was at one of these movies when the Japanese surrendered, quit. And on Okinawa, that was, I don't believe you'll ever see a bigger 4th of July celebration. The ships turned on all their lights, the harbor was lit up like and they started shooting these big guns into the air, and there was hundreds of Americans killed on Okinawa the night the peace was signed. So it gave you a feeling we better get back to camp. We went back to camp, stood up with our helmets on to keep shrapnel from falling. The next morning when it was all over, our tents were full of holes and shrapnel of shooting. Even the men were so happy they got out and shoot the rifles right straight up in the air, Well, anything goes up, it's got to come down. And it just tore our tents all to pieces. And there was numerous men in the service that was killed that night, just from shrapnel.
And when did you get your discharge?
I got discharged in December of 45.
And where did you get your discharge?
Where did I get it?
Yes.
Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
And you came back to Woodward?
Come back to Woodward, and I've lived Woodward all my life.
Hey, what kind of work did you go into after the war?
I was working, before I went in, I was working in a vulcanized race-ready tire shop. When I come back, I worked for about 5 months. Then I went into the painting and contracting business, and I've been in the painting contracting business the rest of my life.
My next question is the tornado.
The Woodward tornado, very vividly. I went through the Woodward tornado. Would you like some of the experiences of what I experienced that night?
Yes, sir.
All right, the night, the build up to the Woodward tornado was on April the 9th. My wife and I weren't married at this time. The tornado was on April 9th on a Wednesday. We were planning on getting married on a Saturday. We had invested all of our what little savings we might have had, and we bought a home. And I was at the house. My wife went to the show that night, and the experience we had with it, I was putting the finishing touches to our house, was getting ready to move into it. And all at once, I had 2 brothers and a nephew that was there with me, and all at once the wind came up. The storm was something that I'd never experienced a storm. And one of my brothers, the lights all went out, and one of my brothers said, "Do you have a cave in this?" There was a house that I bought. I said, "Yeah, there's a little storm cave off of the back porch. It was just for, fruit and stuff like this. Had a hot water tank and things down in there." And so we went back, and when we opened the door, the wind was so terrific that it just knocked you down. So we all fell on the floor, and why, I don't know, maybe an army experience done it to me. Well, when we was bottom, I started calling names. Well, my older brother didn't answer. So I went back up the stairway and feeling around, and I caught him by the hand, And then my other brother grabbed me by the waist and then jerked him down in there. He hit the porch, or the cell, and knocked all his teeth loose, my older brother. But when we hit the floor of the basement, the little old basement, the whole house left. It was so, you could look up and just see the clear sky above you, and everything flying through the air. And you feel the walls of the cave trying to come in on you, or protruded about a foot above it. And the bathroom was just above this little basement, and the trap on the stool in the bathroom, it has a big trap. It tore the stool off, and the whole house left, but this trap come down, and it just caught the top of my head and my nephew's head just enough that it swung down so hard. It just caught it enough, it just skinned both of us. That's how close it come to hitting us right upside the head. And it just skinned both of us right across the top of our head. And but then we got out of this, and the house that we owned, there was nothing left of it. It even tore the foundation down. We never even found the bathroom fixtures or the kitchen cabinets or anything. But the experience we had with it was my nephew's car was sitting outside. It was a 2-bedroom house and had a double garage. It blowed all this away, and it never even touched his car. His car didn't even have a scratch on it. Didn't break the windows out or anything. Out in the front yard, we had a elm tree that was probably a foot or foot and a half across. And it tore the chrome off of a car from somewhere and penetrated clear through. One end that was sticking out one end of the tree and one out the other. In fact, I think it's still in that tree. I never did take it out. I sold the house, but I think it's still in that tree. And of course, then my wife was at the show, and they came down, but everything in the area where I lived in 1100 block on Kansas was completely destroyed. And my wife was at the show, and they come back, and I had a Universal Jeep at that time. I just bought a new one, and it had the old canvas curtains. They were sitting on Main Street, and all the cars up and down Main Street were just piled up on top of each other, tore up, and it never touched that Jeep. Didn't even tear a curtain off. My wife and I, whenever we finally got settled down, but it was before we was married, of course, but we went all night long. And in the Woodward tornado, out of our family, there was 11 of us that lived in Woodward. 7 of the brothers and sisters lost their homes, and my folks lost their home. So 7 of us out of 11 had lost our homes in the Woodward tornado.
What did you do after it went through? What did you do?
After the tornado had went through, of course, we realized that everything was running. And to me, to visualize the tornado I would have to say it reminded me of the war. Everything was gone, everything was black, the houses were tore up, and everywhere you look around the horizon, something was burning. You know, it caused fire. And after it was over, my wife came down. Of course, we started looking for my folks, and we started looking for her folks. Her folks lived right across from the Woodward County Courthouse. And we went out, and they weren't there. Their house was completely gone. And we started looking for these people, and we went down, and we found her folks over by the courthouse. They had crawled underneath the table.
Okay, you were looking for your folks.
Yeah, looking for my wife's folks, and we found them over at the courthouse. And of course, both of them were injured. Of course, when their house left, they got underneath the table, and the house just folded up on top of them. But they were over at the courthouse, and we finally got them over into a little basement, over into an area there that had a basement, and finally got them loaded into the Jeep, and they were both injured enough to be. We couldn't hospitalize them, of course. The hospital was full. So we did take them over to one of my wife's aunts. Well, we started driving around, to help people. Of course, I had this Jeep, and it wasn't hurt. So we picked up numerous people and took them to the hospital. Mr. Jordan, I remember very vividly, my brother and I picked him up and carried him into the Woodward Hospital with his leg was completely torn off. Was just hanging on shreds. This was quite an experience to go through. Then, a little while after that, they come and ask us if we wanted to go down to the mortuary and identify. And we was trying to find the little girl was a cousin of my wife's, little Joanne Gay. Most people have heard about this. Woodward told me this was a cousin of my wife's. This little girl was never found. And But we went to the funeral home and tried to identify, but it was very hard to identify anybody. It seemed like that they were either cut up so bad or splinters, and you just couldn't identify anybody. To me, it was a harder situation to go through the Woodward tornado than it was to go through the war.
Okay.
Because you knew everybody. Like in Woodward, where everyone was hurt, you had so many kills. There was over 100 people. Of course, at that time, the town was small enough that we knew pretty everybody, and it was closer to home deal. Overseas, to me, the people you see nowhere weren't close to you. This is what I'm trying to refer to. In other words, you knew these people. You knew them. You'd known them since you was a little kid. Growing up. This Mr. Jordan, I'd known him all my life. Ever since I was a kid, but he died.
What's the most vivid thing about the tornado that comes to mind?
The most vivid thing is, to me, the most vivid thing to me on the Woodward tornado is when we had to go to the funeral.
Yeah.
Try to go to identify people, and they had them even laying out on the grass, and took water hoses and washed people off, to try to identify them, and then he was trying to identify them by flashlight. This was very, to me, this is what the vivid thing that I always remember.
How big was that funnel cloud? Anyone really know?
I really don't know. See, the one that hit Woodward come in, it started White Deer, Texas, and ended at both of them was White Deer and White Horse or something. Anyhow, it come right across Woodward. But what happened to Woodward, it went through Woodward, hit the river and come back and went back again. And one of the most vivid things I think that happened, or that evening after we got to talking about it, was some people that lived out in the northwest part of town. It blew the baby out of a lady's arms and blew it right up into the windmill and just completely destroyed it. They never found the baby after that. And I think the most vivid thing that I can remember is these people that they couldn't identify. There's 3 people buried out here that they don't know who they are. And of course, this little girl here, Joanne Gay, they've never found any trace of her.
No idea what happened to her?
The nearest they could trace it was her granddad traced it. Now, her dad and her dad and mother were both killed, but her little sister, that's just older than her, was in the hospital, and she swears that this little girl was with her. But she said that some men come through, both of them had on khaki breeches, and said they took the little girl. Now, she said she didn't remember whether she was dead or what happened, but that was the last trace they ever had of her. But the little girl was at the hospital. They've never found trace of her to this day.
And did you have a business here in Woodward at the time?
No, I worked for the other man at this time.
Did it destroy where you worked?
Yes, and it was next door to where I lived, so we were out of a job and everything else for, quite a while.
How did you rebuild anything? How did you get back on your feet?
All right, the Red Cross came in, which they help people, and they done a lot of good. I think they done a lot of damage as far as building. But on my part, I went in and got a small disaster loan. They called it a small disaster loan, and I built my home back right where I lost it.
Mm-hmm. What kind of job did you have then?
I was working for a painting contractor. I was making $1.25 an hour.
Oh, was
But
business good after that?
Yeah,
People
business.
building back?
Well, after they started building back, it was good, see. But it took a while before it ever got back around on its feet. Of course, we had a few places in town other than where the tornado hit, But we done other things besides painting then. When we had to
How long has it taken Woodward to build back?
I'd say it took a good 20 years to get back on its feet. Really, there's still scars of the tornado in Woodward.
There are.
And there's a partial wall downtown, one building is still, a partial wall about 3 foot that's still standing.
They gonna leave it there? Or?
Yeah, they just left it. It'll probably eventually, some won't tear it out, but there is scars up it all over.
Mm-hmm. Well, anything else?
And not that I know of. Anything that I'm glad to give you anything that I can give you on it.
Well, I think we have a good interview.
Well, that's good, and maybe we can get some of the other boys in then.
Thank you.
Okay.